Okay, so as promised, we've covered the male side of things up through spermatogenesis. Here now we're going to cover the female side of things, again starting with the basic anatomy and then moving forward into some of the physiology of it. Okay, so if on the male side we had a testy as the male gonad, on the female side we have an ovary, or ovaries, there are two of them, and these produce gametes here, ova, okay, or eggs. If you want to call them eggs, it's fine with me, I don't care. But just like the male side, they're also there to produce hormones, particularly estrogen. And estrogen comes in a number of different forms: estrone, estriol, estradiol. I don't care. You can call them all estrogen. That's fine with me. And progesterone. And just like before, we have a series of tubes and duct work to connect us to the outside world. Fewer in this particular case. So these are the uterine tubes. Sometimes we call these fallopian tubes, okay, which connect us to the uterus and then to the outside world through the vagina via, there is one other part in here, the cervix, which is kind of the gatekeeper between the vagina and the uterus. Female side of things is a little more internal. Almost all of the parts here are going to be within the pelvic cavity themselves, inclusive of the vagina. Okay, so everything north of the vagina, basically, vagina, cervix, uterus, uterine tubes, ovaries, all of that stuff resides internally. The external genitalia are really just kind of the analogs of the penis and the scrotum in the female side. Literally the same embryonic tissue forms these things. So this is going to be the clitoris, which is structurally identical to the penis, erectile tissue, there's a gland, there's a root, there's a shaft, all of that stuff. Same place, everything. The only thing that's different is that it doesn't incorporate the urethra inside of it. The urethra is separate from it. And then we have the labia majora, and minora, which are equivalent to the tissues of the scrotum. Okay, so here we have one view. We're going to see a couple of different views because female anatomy is a little more three-dimensional than male. Starting at the outside, right here we have the external anatomy, the labia majora, minora. If you want to use the Latin terms, you can. It doesn't really matter to me. And then the clitoris here, you can see the glands of the clitoris here, and the root and the erectile tissue of the clitoris up there. Just north of, or just anterior to, the urethra, which is behind. Then we have the vagina, cervix, the uterus, uterine tube, or the fallopian tube, and the ovary behind that. Here in posterior view, although anterior view is really not much different, we have now just the organs of the reproductive system isolated from that. So the vagina, you can see here the cervix, right, kind of being this little muscular extension of the uterus down into the vagina. As a result, we have this little groove that runs around it, okay, called the fornix. If you use, say, like a diaphragm as a reproductive prophylactic kind of thing, that diaphragm is going to sit in around on that fornix, for example. So that's what you use. If you're using something, whatever, that's a relevant term for you. It's also a place where things can get kind of trapped in there and infections can occur in there. So it's not great. Within the cervix, we have this little canal, which is normally blocked by mucus. There's a little plug of mucus that sits in there all but like 1 week out of your monthly cycle. Kind of looks like a little top hat, like that, believe it or not. But it prevents things from entering into the uterus when we don't want them to get in there. Uterus behind, there are two fallopian or uterine tubes over that, and then the ovary. Now, the interesting thing about the way that the ovary and the uterine tubes are connected, is that they're actually not connected. On the male side of things, the seminiferous tubules dump directly. They're directly connected to the epididymis. There's no way for things to escape. Here, the ovary is not actually directly connected to the uterine tube at all. It's kind of nearby. And what we end up with is a situation where, so if here's our ovary, right? The uterine tube kind of comes around and is just here, right? It's just kind of nearby, right? And our great hope, our massive hope, is that during ovulation, when the ovum itself is ejected from the ovary, our great hope is that it ends up in here. Sometimes it doesn't, right? Sometimes they end up, most of the time they end up in here, right? Sometimes they end up out here. They end up in your abdominal cavity. That just happens, right? So to kind of try to help prevent loss here, you have these little finger-like projections that come out from the end of the fallopian tube. These guys right here, called fimbriae. Okay, and those kind of surround the ovary and try to guide ovulated ovae into the uterine tube. They're not 100% successful, but that's what we try to do. In order to keep things from jiggling around in here, right, again, because these two are not connected, these two things here are not connected, we're going to do our best to hold them in place with a big old ligament here called the broad ligament. Okay? And that broad ligament has three parts. I'm going to label them. I'm not going to expect you to know them. The mesovarium connects to the ovary. The mesosalpinx connects to this part of the uterine tube. And the mesometrium connects all of this stuff to the uterus. But again, I'm not going to make you remember that. Broad ligament, yes, remember that. Suspensory ligament, which is this guy. Actually, not that guy right there, I'm sorry. It's the round ligament of the ovary. There's the round ligament of the uterus as well. The suspensory ligament is this guy right here, all holding things in place. I'm not going to ask you to identify them on an exam or anything, but remember the names because they are really important, holding the whole thing in place, trying to keep things from shifting out of alignment. Now, development of the ovary, the ova within the ovary is a pretty interesting story. We're going to gloss over parts of it here. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time with it, but we'll hit the highlights here. We're going to start with a structure called a follicle. And a follicle, the fact that this is a follicle becomes really, really important for us later on. The follicle contains both the oocyte, okay, and then the follicle itself. So we've got kind of this tissue out here made up of the follicle. Sometimes there's granulosa, okay, and then within it, right here, we have the oocyte itself. And this follicle is going to go through several stages of development, okay? The primordial follicle is just the oocyte and the follicle itself. As we age, okay, we're going to go from oocyte and our little follicle. Okay, we're going to start adding layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of granulosa to it. So the older the egg, the older the follicle becomes, the more mature the follicle becomes, the more layers of granulosa we find in it. As we continue to develop this follicle, right, we're going to end up with, so if here's our follicle, and this is, bear with me, okay. Within the follicle, we have the ovum, and then this big cavity inside here. This cavity is antrum. And so by the time we get to that stage, we are what we call an antral or vesicular, sometimes a tertiary follicle. This is fully mature. This does not mean that the ovum has completely undergone meiosis and is done. It just means that the follicle is mature. And by that, we mean it's ready for ovulation. Okay, so this antrum continues to grow and develop, and the whole thing swells, and as a result, the follicle actually bulges out. So if here's our ovary, right, this vesicular follicle actually bulges out of it. And eventually we're going to get to a point where it ruptures, right? Kind of is ejected. The follicle bursts, okay, and the ovum, the oocyte, ovum, whatever you want to call it, is actually ejected, is shot out, okay, hopefully into the uterine tube, maybe not, okay. The follicle is left behind, okay, and that follicle is going to develop into a term, we're going to revisit this term later on, called the corpus luteum, okay. And remember this term, this is going to come back and be a very, very valuable thing for us in the next chapter. Okay, so ducts, right? Remember again, the ovary not directly connected to the ductwork at all. The oocyte just kind of gets tossed out. Hopefully the fimbriae gather it into the uterine tube, maybe not. Okay, some of them do get lost in the abdominal cavity. We travel down the fallopian tubes or the uterine tubes, into the uterus, across the cervix, into the vagina, and theoretically out of the body. Focus here on the uterus just for a second. Part of this uterus is the cervix. This is the part that sticks down into the vagina. There is a cervical canal within it. This is how semen gets into the uterus. This is how babies get out of the uterus. And again, most of the time, this cervical canal is plugged up by that little top hat of mucus. Right? It's only a small window of time, a couple of days, where this top hat is missing and things can come into or out of the uterus. Whether you remember the internal and external os or not, particularly care, they're just the ends of that cervical canal. As far as the uterus itself goes, it's pretty interesting. I think it's pretty interesting anyway. There are 3 layers to it: a perimetrium, which is the peritoneum; the myometrium, which is a massive, huge chunk of muscle, smooth muscle, but muscle nonetheless; and then the endometrium, which is the mucosa. And this endometrium is very, very special. So the endometrium is divided further into 2 layers: a stratum functionalis, functional layer, right? This is literally what it means in Latin. Stratum basalis, or the basal layer. Stratum basalis is permanent. It's always there. It's mitotically active. Okay. The stratum functionalis is the part that gets shed during menstruation. So every monthly cycle, right, you grow a new stratum functionalis, and then you shed that stratum functionalis. Then you grow a new one, and you shed it. Shed it, grow a new one, and you shed it. So it's continuously replenishing itself. The vagina itself is less structurally interesting. It is the female organ of copulation, which is the penis is the male organ of copulation. It's about 8 to 10 centimeters in length, so not particularly long, honestly, and exists between the urethra in front and the rectum behind. Again, we saw a cartoon of this a while back, right? So here's the rectum back here. Here's the urethra up front. The vagina exists between those 2. It is muscular. There is a smooth muscularis layer within there. Because it is connected to the outside world, the inner layer is a mucous membrane. Okay. That mucous membrane is originally closed off in some, I hesitate to even say most. I don't know that we really actually have good data on this. The data on this is weird and, I don't know, kind of creepy, honestly, because of what it is. It's usually closed off as a hymen prior to initial intercourse. As a result, this has been one of those virginity tests, and it's a whole gross, creepy history behind all of that nonsense. The worst part of it all is that some girls are born without one. Some girls are born with one that's incomplete. Some girls have a complete one, but it ruptures because they are not sitting around doing nothing all day. Like if you ride a horse or you run or jump or you're active in any way, shape, or form, this hymen can rupture from that. I don't know. Like I said, it's gross and creepy history is really unimportant to us. Suffice to say, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. It just is what it is. And then going back to that fornix, that is, again, if you our vagina here, right, with our cervix coming down into it, and our cervical canal in the middle. This groove around the top there, that's our fornix. The clitoris, this is the analog of the penis. Again, same tissue, just doesn't incorporate the urethra. Okay, so there's a glans, there is a foreskin or a prepuce, just as there is in the male side. It's really the same thing, honestly. You can refer to this part. We'd often do it in reference to the female side. We can do it in reference to the male side as well. There's an area here called perineum, which is what this is here. So the pubic symphysis sits there. This is the perineum here. Okay. And it basically just contains all of this stuff, right? So the ischial tuberosities are here, pubic symphysis there, coccyx behind. That gives us the four corners of our perineum. Now, the physiology here, we touched on this a little bit already. The physiology here is actually really quite fascinating. For a long time, and honestly, there's still a lot of evidence to suggest this remains true. The total number of eggs is present at birth. Okay. There is evidence to suggest that stem cells can produce new eggs. I don't know, and again, literally, I don't know. This is it's possible that this evidence exists, but I don't know for sure. But I don't think we've ever actually witnessed or had any evidence for the production of new eggs via stem cells post-parturition, post-birth. Potential is there. I don't know if it actually does happen. So, but it would be pretty interesting, pretty exciting if it was true. So just as we had spermatogenesis, we have oogenesis on the female side. Number of important differences here for females. Spermatogenesis occurs throughout the man's life, okay? In the sense that it's a continually occurring process. We're always producing new ones. Females, it does not, it's not a lifelong process. It stops at what's our late for? It stops when the production of female hormones gets turned way down. It is sort of in midlife. So it's not a lifelong process, but it is a lifelong process in the sense that it begins in utero. So while you are developing in your mother's womb, oogenesis is occurring in your body, which is just mind-blowing to me to think about. Meiosis 1, the first part of meiosis, starts while you are still in utero, which is just crazy to me, just absolutely crazy to me. But it stops, right? It doesn't get very far. If you remember your stages of mitosis, prophase is the first one, right? This process stalls out in prophase of meiosis 1. So it really doesn't get very far, but it does begin. And it doesn't continue, doesn't pick up back again until puberty. Right? So at puberty, one or a handful of these oocytes gets picked to continue meiosis. Okay, we begin the meiotic process. And so we're going to start by going from our primary oocyte. We're going to divide into two cells. One cell is basically just DNA cell membrane. Okay, and this is the polar body. The other one, it's a fairly large cell. It shouldn't be any bigger than this, but I drew it bigger. Sorry, but it's got DNA and Oogenesis. One end. Okay, so this is the end result of meiosis 1, is we have one cell that's actually going to be something in a polar body. We're going to pause here then, right? Ovulate. We're still stuck at this point. We're beginning meiosis 2, but we're not going to finish it. Okay, so we get ovulated, we get put out into the uterine tube, the fallopian tube. We still haven't finished meiosis yet. And if we don't get fertilized, we never do, right? We will never ever finish meiosis 2. So we actually can, I guess, expect that most eggs never actually go through meiosis all the way. They kind of stop. They only are going to finish meiosis 2 if they merge with a sperm cell. Okay, and if they do, so here's our little sperm, right? He's one egg. Here's our secondary oocyte, also one end. If they mix and mingle and get together, okay, here's our zygote. We end up with two cells. We end up with 2N in our secondary polar body, which is pretty wild. Okay, so the reason we're going to call this here is that if this happens, we're into development, and that's the next chapter of the book. So we're going to call it here, and then the next chapter is literally going to pick up with this process. So I will see you guys in just a minute. We'll kind of continue our story here with